boy dies in no man's land. His body is stripped of his uniform, which is taken to be washed. The blood rinsed out. The uniform is dried. Bullet holes and shrapnel tears are repaired by seamstresses. Name tags ripped out of the collar. They are pressed, folded, repackaged. A boy lives, forging his parents' signature on the consent form on the back of his friends. Paul is eager to be a part of the greatest adventure a young man can ever go on. War. He's given a uniform. Upon closer examination of the collar, Paul notices it already has a name written on it, the name of a dead boy who died in no man's land. He lets the officer know the uniform belongs to someone else. "Ah, yes," the officer replies. "Probably too small for the lad. Happens all the time," he tells Paul before ripping out the name. He discards the tag on the floor, on top of other tags with forgotten names written on them, the names of dead soldiers. Paul, in a bit of foreshadowing, is wearing a dead man's uniform. Thus the cycle begins anew. A boy dies. Another lives, avidly replacing him. And the officers in World War I treat these souls with about as much regard as unwanted cloth. This is all quiet on the Western Front. There is something to be said about the intrinsic nature that lies within most young men's hearts that makes them want to experience the greatest adventure that is war. When we meet Paul and his friends, they are the embodiment of what most young men are, romanced by death, yearning to stare the ultimate end in the face and live to tell about it. To be able to bounce their grandchild on their knee, and when the grandchild asks him, "What did you do during the war, Grandpa?" he can at least say, "Well, I didn't shovel shit in Bavaria." But as soon as the young chaps are greeted with the realities of the trenches, the romance is quickly shelled away. "Welcome to mechanized war on a scale the world has never seen before, boys. Hope you brought an extra pair of underwear, because you will be shitting yourselves." Imagine never knowing what a tank was, and then seeing one grease its treads with your friend's guts. Imagine only hearing about an airplane through stories and newspaper clippings, and then have a squadron of them chase you down, zipping bullets by your ears. Imagine knowing what a cannon is, but the ones used in this war are practically recoilless, making their rate of fire much more quicker than any cannon fired before. You know what a gun is, the bolt-action rifle you hunted with on the family farm. Now imagine encountering a machine gun nest for the first time in history. Imagine never knowing that a flamethrower even existed until Mr. Barbecue decides to show up and cook your friend right before your eyes. That was World War I for these boys. And what made World War I all that more hellish was the fact that it was a war of attrition, one side slugging it out with the other. No sort of military strategy or tactics seemed to have applied to this war, other than our pawns are in this trench, their pawns are in that trench. The goal is to move our pawns into their trench before they move their pawns into ours. Millions of men died for only a few hundred feet of land in between both trenches. The first night in the trench, Paul and his friends are treated to the violence that is shelling. They take cover in a bunker, where the romance of war is quickly wiped off the face of the earth, and the nightmare of reality begins. All the tropes are in this bunker. The salty vets who are as calm as a summer breeze. For the new guys, though, they're scared shitless. One new guy tries to run out, only to be the first to die by taking a shell to the face. Another new guy is so panic-stricken, he resorts to banging his head against the wall like it was a padded cell. Eventually, the bunker takes a direct hit, causing it to collapse, and with it, all of Paul's romantic ideas about war. All that is left now is repugnance, revulsion, and repulsion throughout the rest of the picture for Paul. And a picture it is indeed. The cinematography shines throughout All Quiet on the Western Front like a popped flare in the middle of a blackened night, highlighting the horrorscape that is no man's land, only to be contrasted with the beautiful, quiet, wide shots of the landscape. The color is only saturated enough to give that antiquated documentary feel. It's hard not to draw comparisons to how masterfully Roger Deakins shot 1917, but James Friend's keen eye gives him a run for his money, and I would be surprised if he isn't nominated for every major award when the season comes. All Quiet is also masterfully directed and acted. Newcomer Felix Kramerer brings an empathetic performance as Paul, where you truly watch the innocence drain from him, only to be replaced with hopelessness and despair. We follow young Paul as he witnesses the harsh realities of war. He lives on as his friends die, manages to make it from battle to battle barely alive, trying to survive just a minute longer through the bullets, the shellings, the push-throughs by enemy tanks, the biplane attacks, and enemy flamethrowers. In one particular scene, when Paul takes cover in a crater, we're treated to how war brings out the animal in all of man. Forced to kill or be killed, he stabs a Frenchman, but not to death. Paul's forced to hear the man die slowly and painfully next to him in the crater. His animalistic nature subsides, and his humanity returns. He attempts to save the Frenchman from the several knife wounds that he himself has shanked into him, but the damage is done, and the Frenchman dies in Paul's arms. And director Edward Berger does not let up, even when we beg him. Most notably in this scene mentioned, or when we witness a tank crushing one of Paul's comrades. We appeal for the camera to cut away, but the director demands we feel powerless to do anything about it, as these men slowly and painfully die. All Quiet on the Western Front, on its own merits, is a good war film, depicting the tragedy that was World War I with relentless terror, leaving the audience to beg someone to stop the madness. But the villains are not the French in the trench. It's the leadership that continues to order the men over the top and rush to their death. Leadership who treats these young souls about as cheap as a used tissue. These boys are thrown away only for their leadership, like that of General Friedrich, to pluck out another soul from the box. Far away from the front, the general has his choice of wine to sip on and bird to eat. He can afford to throw scraps from his plate down for his dog, while his men are reduced to stealing eggs from local farmers. And he does all this while espousing what the duty of a soldier really means. He leads from the rear, and knowing it's mere hours before the war is officially over, has his men needlessly charge an enemy position, and has them killed over the sole sake of pride. But the horrors of the war extend beyond the days of its end, as Paul discovers when one of his friends is badly wounded, and decides it's better to take his own life rather than live the rest of his life as an amputee. The morning after which, we finally have the one scene Paul shares with his villain. That's when the general orders them to attack the French line one more time, an hour before the end of the war. Disheveled, most of Paul's division marches back. Some protest, but are immediately shot for displaying such a small semblance of rational thought. These men are trapped, run to certain death, or stay behind and be marched to it. The choice is yours. You realize now how much symbolism in All Quiet on the Western Front deals with being trapped. Butterflies are trapped in jars, beetles inside of matchboxes, and insects are guided by knife point. These are the men trapped inside their trenches, and the generals trapped in their own hideous mindset that attrition is the only way to win this war. At this point, Paul's decision, along with the majority of his division, is robotic. He's just got to survive one more hour, and he almost does, only to be stabbed in the back moments before the official end of the war is announced, and the fighting stops. And this is where I should bring up my issues with All Quiet on the Western Front, starting with the ending first. The final moments of the 1930 silent film masterpiece is layer upon layer of meaning. Paul's reaching for a butterfly, only to be shot and killed by a sniper. Or the anticlimactic ending of the source material, where Paul is gassed, given 14 days of leave, and has time to think about all that he's lost, and what horrors await him when he returns home. Eventually, he is killed a month before the armistice, and the book highlights the indignity of it all by noting it was an extraordinarily calm, peaceful day. The call to replace these endings with Paul being stabbed in the back in an enemy bunker is a call I don't see justifiable. This ending makes Paul's death seem too personal and felt like another attempt to hammer in a message already bombarded in the collective audience's head well before this point. File this talking point for a moment. We'll come back to it later. Also, the relationships between Paul and his friends, who all joined the war together, seem rushed. Subsequently, I didn't feel one way or the other when each one kicked the bucket as they progressed through the war. It would have been better if we spent more time with them, as they romanticized about the war, and their teacher fed them propaganda, and encourages them to join the army. Paul's the only one we watch go from innocent adolescent to frightened young man to stressed out animal. And it's for these reasons that this version of All Quiet on the Western Front resembles less of its source material and more of the Russian film named Come and See, where a young Soviet boy is thrusted into the brutalities of World War II, and by the time the movie ends, he looks like he aged by about 60 fucking years. Be warned, it's a movie not for the faint of heart, but if you haven't watched Come and See, I highly recommend it. And All Quiet, resembling this film, is not bad at all. For Come and See is about as an excellent war film as you're going to get, but it has an entirely different message than the one here. This version of All Quiet seems to be devoted to one redundant message. War is bad. A painless message to grasp onto, if you ask me, but it's also an empty platitude. Much like life's a mystery, or nobody's perfect, or when nothing's going right, go left. Yet the silent film and source material was a scathing commentary on what and who glorifies war to the point it drives young men to want to be a part of it. For that, we needed to spend a little bit more time with Paul and his friends, as they kept being provoked by propaganda and their authority figures. In the book, those who controlled the message purposely lied to these young men in order to sacrifice their lives for a few hundred feet of land. The ruling parties, such as the media, politicians, authority figures, teachers, knew nothing about war, but talked it up as some rite of passage for boys to become men. Paul and his friends were fed lie after lie until they were gaslit into signing their lives away and become part of a terror the world has never seen before. But sure, let's water down the message to war is bad. Wouldn't want to have a message that mirrors some of the issues we face with today's media, politicians, and authority figures as a possible third world war looms over our heads. That might be asking for a little too much. With that all being said, I feel that it should also be brought up the good merits to the liberties Ed Berger took with the book, most notably adding the parallel story of the signing of the truce. Now I know some people had a problem with this, but they can all get ran over by a tank and go to hell. This gives the audience a ticking time bomb. This is what we like to call cinematic irony. We want the Germans to get on with it and sign the papers. Don't think, sign. Paul's out there being a savage in a crater while Dr. Zippo is flaming up the place. We don't care if the Germans give away the farm, we just want Paul and his friends the hell out of there. So does this version of All Quiet on the Western Front topple the 1930 silent film masterpiece? No, it does not. Not by a country mile or a World War I yard. But this version does accomplish what it sets out to achieve, and for that alone, it should not be overlooked. It's a good war film that everyone needs to watch at least once, even if it's just to get a microcosmic look into what these boys had to endure during the biggest war the planet has ever seen before its hit sequel, WWII. And for that alone, I highly recommend All Quiet on the Western Front for its amazing technical achievements, fantastic cinematography, and superb acting. And now if you will excuse me, I'm out of here.